So I'm going to share my screen. We're going to take a look at what week one held. Quick kind of review of last week. Pretty straightforward. Share screen. There we go. Cool. I'm going to review week one really briefly. Right, and the way to navigate our course best is to click on, right, each week is also a module. Module 1, week 1, module 2, week 2, and so on, right? We have 13 weeks together. So week 1, tap that to get started. No problem. Yeah, mine crashed as soon as I launched it today. Like, I totally understand. So week 1, every module is going to have this overview and to-do list page, right? And this to-do list, like, these are the things that you need to do to complete the module. So turn in the syllabus, complete the pre-survey. And again, the pre-survey scoring 0 out of 20 is a great score. And anything above that is a great score, right? It doesn't affect your grade. So it's literally a no pressure thing. You just go in and answer the questions. If you know it, great. If you don't, that's okay too. Or if you don't even want to look at it, you just click an answer and just finish it. It doesn't matter. But on the post survey, I want you to look at the questions and answers. Lexicon. I'm going to jump into that one a little bit deeper, but this is the app that you need, Lightroom. Go into self-service and get the app called Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. Adobe Photoshop Lightroom. And then there's a getting to know you discussion where you could just copy the prompts, paste them into the reply, answer those questions, and then reply to one classmate to get full credit. Until you reply to a classmate, you only get partial credit. Did someone have a question? No? Okay. So here's what I would do at a minimum with this lexicon stuff, our vocabulary, the words we need to learn. At a minimum, I would go in here, and this first week has a lot of words. Week 2 doesn't have as many. And we're going to look at the week 2 words. You just joined, please type here into the chat window, HERE, and welcome. Please type here into the chat window so I can get the attendance right. So I would copy, at a minimum, I would do this. Oh my goodness. Work with me, computer. There we go. I would copy everything. And then I would open up a notes page. And I know I just stopped sharing, but I'm going to share my notes page. Make a new note. I would say lexicon. Enter. 1. And then I would paste all of that below there. This way, you're at the end, you'll have this one page that has all of the words that we need to learn in one space. And then type week 2. That way you're ready for week 2, which is where we're about to go. Is there anyone who's like, I don't understand? The idea is for you to create flashcards, right? And on one side of the card, it would say photography. And on the other side, you would write all of these words that are underlined. And you would end up with a deck of flashcards. And if you really want to learn these words, that's what you'll do. But at a minimum, you should at least take them and put them all on one long page. So when you take exams, quizzes, check on learning, whatever, you'll be able to go to one place to find all those definitions, because that's what a lot of the quizzes are going to be. All right. So one note page that has, all of your lexicon for each week, every time we jump to a new one. Any questions about that? Nope. Let me go back to week 1. Cool. All right, so I'm just going to click next. It's the best way to navigate our course. All right, from page to page, just click next. There's that discussion page. Click next. All right, so again, week 1, those of you who missed it or haven't finished it yet, syllabus, pre-survey, get your vocabulary, your lexicon, download that Lightroom app, which we're going to start using pretty soon, and then participate in the getting to know you discussion. That takes care of week 1. Any questions about week 1? Oh, my chat window closed, but doesn't look like there's anything in there either. Cool. Those that joined late, I think somebody just joined while I was talking about this. Please type here into the chat window. Please type here into the chat window. That way, when I take attendance and I check the attendance versus who's still here later on, I'll have your name in there so I can account for you. All right, so week 2, here we go. You should have gotten a newsletter in your email and a notification that there's an announcement, right? So before each week starts, I'm going to put out a newsletter, and that newsletter is going to give you a bit of information. It kind of breaks down everything into one neat little condensed space, right? So these are the 3 big assignments for this week. Our lexicon, which is where we're going to start here in a minute. It's not graded, but it is important for later quizzes and tests. The camera modes discussion, 20 formative points, and that is due by the 18th of December, which is Friday. And then there is a check on learning, COL. And this check on learning is going to cover stuff from module 1 and module 2. And that's not due until the 4th of January. However, in our next Zoom, if you don't have it complete, we're going to stay on to give you time, right, to work on it. There is a second page, and that's these notes. You can use these notes during the exam, the quiz, the check on learning. And I promise you that it's going to be like verbatim what's on the check on learning. Okay, like if you use these notes when you do the quiz, you're going to do great. But let's say you don't complete it and you want to wait until the 4th of January, you can study these notes also during the break. Nobody wants to do that. Nobody's like, I'm going to study during my break, right? I get that. So that's why on our next Zoom, if you haven't completed it yet, we're going to do it together in class. So this is, some people like to see information in different ways. This is also going to become a video, this Zoom session. Maybe you prefer it that way. Maybe you like an easy visual, or maybe you just want to read paragraphs. Whatever works for you. So announcements. If you missed week 1, there is a newsletter for week 1 that also went into your email. Covers the same things we talked about. And you can always download a PDF file of each one. Whew, got that out of the way. So here we are, week 2. And it's got these 3 pages. These 3 pages are the lessons. This is where we're going to get the information we need to know. These last 2 are actual graded assignments. So here's the lexicon for this week, right? Much less than week 1. I'm going to do the minimum. This is the minimum. I'm going to copy all of these things. I advise you to do the same. Copy it all. Go into that notes page that we created. And paste that there, week 2. If you are somebody who's going to make your flashcards, that's awesome. If you're really somebody who's like, I want to become a really good photographer, then you definitely want to learn. If you want to work in the industry, you need to learn the words, the vocabulary, the language, the lingo, as it were. So take a moment, get the lexicon out of there, put it where you're going to save it. I'm going to type week 3 here, just so I'm ready for the next module. I need to add. All right, I'll give you till about 48 to get your lexicon words and put them where you need to put them. Safe somewhere, whether you're using Word or notes, doesn't matter. Whatever works for you. I am going to talk about week 2's. So a JPEG. A JPEG is a photo, right? It stands for Joint Photograph Expert Group, and it's a very small file size, really small file size, or highly compressed, right? It has a lot of what's called compression. And to do that, it throws out detail. So the quality of the images tends to be lower, slightly lower quality. But because it's such a small file size, that's what you put on the web, right? So most of the images added or uploaded to the internet are JPEGs. There are others, but that's the most common. RAW files are what we would shoot if we were in our classroom. And some of you will be able to, if you're not using your iPad, right? If you're using a DSLR, if you're using your phone, but if you're using the older iPad 6, like what the school gave me, you won't be able to shoot RAW files. RAW files are uncompressed. So they take up a lot of space, but they're very high quality. Where a JPEG threw out all the detail, a RAW file keeps tons of detail. So that way when you edit it, that photo, when you develop it, you get a lot more out of it. You can bring out details and colors that you didn't even realize were in there. And they have lots of different file types. You know, you'll see files on the internet that end in like a dot, some letters. So a RAW file can be a .dng, which is digital negative, DNG. CR2 is Canon RAW. CR2 is for Canon. .ARWs tend to be on Sony cameras, but they all have their own. Nikon does a .NEF. But basically what you need to know is JPEG, small file, low detail. RAW file, huge files, lots of detail. Noise. Noise is the other word on there. In a photograph, it's a grainy veil that obscures details. It'll be like little speckles all over your image, sometimes multiple colors going on inside of the noise. And you're going to learn how to keep your noise low, but it is often caused by high ISO settings. And you're going to learn what ISO is. But noise is, it tends to lower the quality of the photo. A DSLR, that's a digital single lens reflex. That's those big system cameras. And there are 4 camera types that you need to know about. This will be on a quiz for sure. The 4 camera types are from lowest quality to highest quality. Mobile, right? So your iPads, your phones, things like that. Compact, which are just small cameras. Bridge cameras, which they need to stop making them, but they sort of live in between compact and system cameras. System is the last. So it's mobile, compact, bridge, and system. Going from lower quality to higher quality. Mobile, compact, bridge, system. System cameras are DSLR and mirrorless. My video feed right now is coming to you on a mirrorless camera. And I thought I brought my DSLR up here, but I'll go grab it in a minute. But basically, it's a system of components. Those cameras where you can take the lens off of it and take a battery pack out of it and do all kinds of different things. There's a system of components. Those cameras have a bigger sensor, so they collect more light and have better quality. But they're called system cameras because there's a system of components. And finally, the last word in today's lexicon is motion blur. Motion blur. That is streaking or blurring of moving objects in a photograph. So if you've ever taken a photo and everything in it, like whatever was moving is really, really blurry, that's called motion blur. And you're gonna learn how to create motion blur intentionally, right, as creative uses. Any questions about lexicon before moving on to our lesson on aperture priority mode? Any questions about lexicon stuff, the vocabulary? I got some head shakes and some nothing in the chat. All right, cool. So next. dSLR mode dial, aperture priority mode. So the picture that you see on canvas here is the top of my camera that I'm filming myself with right now. And there is a mode dial on it. And right now it's covered in orange and blue. And the orange is hiding all of these other options because all of those options don't even matter. Like if I were to design a camera, there would only be 3, maybe 4 options on the mode dial. At any rate, we're going to cover what's called AV or A, TV or S, and M. And in doing so, you're going to learn everything you need to know about exposure. Like this week, you're going to learn everything there is to know about making an exposure on a photo. So AV or A is aperture priority. Aperture priority. Every camera manufacturer has their own way of putting this on the mode dial, but this is how it usually shows up, A or AV. Canon, you're going to find AV. So the A on both of them means aperture. On Canons, that V is for value, but it's aperture priority mode. That means the aperture is the priority, meaning you're in control of it. So when you set your camera to auto, you're letting the camera guess, right? It's got a little eyeball there, the lens, and a little computer in there like your brain. And it's looking around and it's going, I think this is probably what it should look like. Right, but it's guessing, whereas you know what you want your photo to look like, just maybe you don't know how to make it do that, and that's what we're going to cover. So the aperture lets you do a couple of things. There is a technical side of it and a creative side of it, right? So technically, we control light, and creatively, we control background blur, or what's also called a depth of field. And so it starts to get complicated, but we have to talk about it first. And then once you start doing it, it's going to make more sense. But right now, if you can look at my video feed, the image that shows my face in the background there, everything's really blurry, right? Think about something like portrait mode on an iPhone or whatever. The aperture is what allows me to make the background blurry. I can change my aperture so that the background is not blurry. And I can also change it so that, of course, it is blurry. This is the creative use. The technical use is to keep light out or let light in. And so the aperture, and I like to work from the lens to the shutter to the sensor, right? So we're starting with what would be the front of the camera. The aperture is inside of the lens, and it's like these little blades that open and close, a lot like the pupil of your eye. If you go outside and it's really, really bright out, your pupils will shrink to help keep light out. And then you come inside and it's dark, your pupils will get really big to let light in. And so I'm going to play this little video. That's what this looks like. This is an aperture inside of a lens opening, letting light in. If you can see the video, and closing, keeping light out. Opening, letting light in. Closing, keeping light out, right? But that's the technical piece, the light part. Creatively, we control blur, right? That background blur. So when it's open, we get lots of light coming in, right? Because it's out of the way, letting light come through. It's also going to make the background blurrier when it's more open. And when it's more closed, when it's closing and it's just a really small hole in the aperture, then the background will not be blurry. So we're going to look at this again, and I'm going to say out loud the technical and the creative. So opening, letting light in and creating lots of background blur. Closing, keeping light out and getting rid of the background blur so everything is in focus. Opening, letting light in and making more blur. Closing it, keeping light out and making everything focused, no blur. Whew. Any questions about the fact that an open aperture makes it blurry and lets in light, and a closed aperture makes it not blurry and blocks out light before I move on? Nope. Okay. So let's read this. It says A or AV allows you to control the aperture, which we just saw it moving, that diaphragm opening and closing. Allows you to control the aperture while the camera makes its best guess on what shutter speed and ISO setting to use. Okay, so that is the exposure triangle. These three items right here, shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. Those are the three items you control on a camera to create an exposure. And we call this the exposure triangle. Okay, so shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. A or AV allows you to control the aperture priority mode, while the camera guesses on shutter speed and ISO. The aperture is inside of the lens and it operates like the pupil in your eye. When the aperture is larger or wide open, it lets in a lot of light, making a brighter exposure. A wide open aperture also allows for you to blur the background of your photo, making your subject stand out, right? And a lot of times that is what photography is about, is isolating the subject from the environment. So right now on my video feed, I'm the subject of the image, and by having everything blurry except for me, I stand out a little bit more. That is commonly referred to as isolating the subject from the environment and is what we call a shallow depth of field. It is a widely accepted professional look. Think of portrait mode on an iPhone where the background is blurred away while the subject is in focus. Right, but on an iPhone, it's doing it with math, whereas with a lens, you're doing it properly with distance and focusing. So the aperture setting is denoted on your camera by the letter F, followed by a number. So when you look at a camera, a DSLR or a mirrorless, a system camera, a compact, and a bridge, they'll have like an f1.8, and that's telling you what aperture setting it is. It's telling you how open or closed that diaphragm of the aperture is. The F number is what tells you that. And so that's what this diagram that I've created here is in orange and blue. So this diaphragm is wide open right here, and it is an f1.2. And this says that everything over here is going to be brighter with background blur. And over here where it's closed, we're at an f22. It's going to be darker because it's a smaller opening. It's blocking out light without background blur. So a large F number is a very small opening that makes the image darker and have less blur. A large F number is a small opening that makes the image darker and have less blur. A small F number is a large opening that makes the image brighter with more blur. And that's it. That part right there covers what most people desire to be able to do with a camera. And that is to make that nice blurry background and have an in focus subject. There's a video here of somebody else explaining this. You can watch it, but I'm going to show two example photos, and then in my video feed, I'm going to physically change my aperture and some other settings so you can see it happening in real time. So here's two photos that I took in my backyard. In this first photo, let me annotate. In this photo here, I'm shooting with an aperture of f1.8. What that means is it's wide open, it's letting lots of light in, and I have lots of blur, right? These flowers that are in the front here are very blurred compared to the flowers in the middle where I've focused on a subject, and the background is very, very blurred as well. This is a very shallow depth of field. There's just a narrow slice of area that's in focus. So these foreground flowers and this background are blurry, while the middle ground is in focus. The other image in here is the same photo, but taken at an f/22 aperture. f/22, meaning it's closed, very, very small opening, not a lot of light coming in. And this foreground flower is pretty much in focus, and the background is in focus, as well as the middle ground. This is a deep depth of field, meaning lots of focus from the front all the way through the middle to the back. You can tell what everything is. In the first photo, you probably couldn't even hardly tell it's a fence. In the second photo, you can totally tell that's like some wood back there, probably a fence. So that's what happens with your photos. So I'm going to show you what happens. I'm going to stop sharing, that way my video feed is full screen. All right. So right now, right, and you can see the background gets blurrier the closer I get, right? You can see the background because I'm changing the distance that the lens is from that sensor. But right now, my camera is on an aperture value of f/1.8. I'm going to make it a larger f number. Are there any guesses as to what might happen to my video feed when I make this aperture value a larger f number?
The background will be less blurry.
Yes. Anything else?
Or your face become less detailed?
I don't think so. I think my face will stay in the same amount of detail. But remember, so there's two things that happen. We control light and we control creatively blur. Aperture, background blur. So
it'll be brighter, right?
No,
it'll be darker.
Yep. So I'm going to make it a larger f number, which closes it and blocks light out. So it's going to get darker and the background will become less blurry, as I think it was Gage who told us that. So here we go. I'm at an f/1.8, f2, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and now I'm at like an f/16. And so now really all you can see, you can hardly see me, right? Because it's blocking the light out. That diaphragm got smaller and you can barely see me. You can make out the lights. I'm going to change some other settings, and we're not going to talk about those settings today, but I'm going to change some other settings so that you can see me. Okay. So when we look at our background where it was before, I'm in focus. The background is also nowhere nearly as blurred as it was before. And now my aperture is at an f/16. And it got darker. So I had to do something else to compensate for the fact that my aperture blocked out all of that light. And that's why there are 3 parts to the exposure triangle. So we have to balance all 3: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. We have to balance all 3 of those to get the photo that we are wanting. So if I wanted it to be the person or subject, whatever it might be, is in focus and not blurry, and the background, the environment that they're in, is also not blurry, right? Maybe the context of the environment that the subject is in is important for your photo, then you have to be at a bigger f number. And I'm going to go back to this diagram before I go back into the live view. There we go. This diagram right here. Let me annotate it. Right. So if you want it to be like where I'm at right now, where I'm the subject and I'm in focus and the background is not super blurry like it was, then you have to be at a larger f number, but it's going to block out light. So that's why we have 3 parts to the exposure triangle. So now I'm going to make my aperture a smaller f number, f value, f stop. I'm going to make that number smaller. And what do you think is going to happen to the video feed? I'm gonna go to a smaller F number. Somewhere around here, I'll be like at f1.8. What's gonna happen to the video feed?
Your
Gonna
face
be too
gets more
bright.
focused.
It'll get too bright, yes. And then somebody said something about focus.
Your face will be more focused.
Yeah, what?
Like it'll be, the background will be blurry because the focus will be on your face.
I think you're both absolutely correct. Let's see, I'm gonna stop sharing the screen. So I'm at an F, what am I at? F16. So now I'm at a F11, F8, F5.6, F4, F2.8, F2, and an F1.8. And so, like you said, it's gonna be too bright. So we can't tell yet if that other part of the guess was true, like that my face will be in focus while the rest is blurred. So I'm gonna change some other settings. These are settings you're gonna learn about later, but they are the other parts of the exposure triangle. So that way I can get the exposure back to normal or something sort of normal. There we go. So now I'm isolated from the background. I've got lots of blur in the background. I'm in focus. And that's all controlled by the aperture. That's what all of this stuff, all of this stuff that I put in here is telling you. Okay, so we have, well, before I get into these questions, before I ask questions, do you have questions? Do you need to see more of that live example? All right. I'm gonna share my screen. And here's my recommendation of how to be successful in this class. After each one of these lessons, these pages, right? And if there's always gonna be a diagram, a visual, there's gonna be words for you to read, there's gonna be videos for you to follow, and there's gonna be examples. After each one, where there's a red check mark that says self-reflection, there are questions that, just like our lexicon, you need to copy and paste into a notes page. But I want to go through this again. So now that we know a small F number is a large opening and that it creates background blur and more light, right? We understand this technical creative a little bit in theory. We've talked about it. Let's think about it as we watch an aperture open and close. So this is, let's say that's about an f1.2, wide open, lots of light, lots of blur. And now we're closing down to maybe f22, barely any light, hardly any blur, and now we're getting bigger, f11, f5.6, f2.8, f1.8. When you see this, let me get rid of that. I want you to be able to visualize what that F number might be, what's happening to light, and what's happening to background blur. So with this current picture of the diaphragm, what is going to happen with the background blur?
There's not gonna be very much.
Right, absolutely. And is this going to be a large F number or a small F number?
Large.
Yep, large F number. Is there going to be a lot of light or very little light?
Little.
Absolutely. And so if that's true, then the opposite must be true. And it is. So right now, looking at this diaphragm, which is almost not even there, do we have a small F number or a large F number?
Small.
Small.
Small F number. Yep. And are we going to get a shallow depth of field or a deep depth of field?
Shallow.
Shallow. Yeah, lots of background blur. And are we going to get a bright exposure or a dark exposure?
Bright.
Right. You guys nailed this. All right, so I'm going to copy all of these questions. Questions on the exam are going to be the exact same as the questions in your self-reflections. It's not going to be all of them. It's going to be a few of them, but they will literally verbatim, word for word, be the exact same questions. So I recommend highlighting all of them, copying them, going into the notes again, creating a new note, right? So I'll have one note page for all of my vocabulary, and I would make a second page. You could run it all on one long notes page, but I'm gonna make a second one, and I'm gonna say photo 1, reflections. And then I'm adding some other, you could just do photo 1 reflections. Then this is module 2 or week 2. Depends on how you want to look at it, but it's the same thing. And then paste those questions in. And then I'll provide answers. The questions are going to be literally verbatim as all of the self-reflections. There will be no mystery, no change. So if you do this, you're going to have all of the questions and answers. It's like a whole new special way of cheating without cheating. This is also how I get around the whole cheating thing. If you Google it while you're taking the quiz, you will likely get a wrong answer. But if you go over here and you pull the question and answer out of our notes, then you're going to get the right answer. And the beautiful thing about this is you can search, right? You can search within your notes. So I will just copy and paste them. Let me answer them with you and search here instead of Google. So you're guaranteed to get the right answers. All right, which leads me to the only way to cheat in my class, again, is to upload images that are not yours, but trying to say that they are yours. There's very few exceptions where I can let somebody turn in photos that are not theirs. And even those exceptions tend to get half credit, right? Which is better than a 0. So which F number, which aperture value will allow more light to reach the camera sensor? An f1.8 or an f22, and it can't be the same person answering every question. Which aperture value or F number will allow more light to reach the camera sensor? F1.8 or F22? And remember, there's a diagram in our notes page. Oh, let me open my chat window. I bet people are answering in there. Yeah, there we go. F1.8, nailed it. Yeah, absolutely, it's this one. Yep, got it. F1.8. That's going to allow more light to reach sensor, wide open, right? Small number means wide open. So which F number will give a shallower depth of field?
F22.
See, I'm tricky. No, it's a F1.8 as well. A shallow depth of field means lots of blur, lots of blur. A deep depth of field will be not so much blur. And so the F22 would give us a very deep depth of field, but an F1.8 is going to give us a shallower depth of field. So out of these two options, F1.8 or F22, which one is shallower? It's an F1.8. And I do these first 3 questions like this on purpose. Which F number will best isolate the subject from the background or from their environment? F1.8 or F22?
1.8.
F1.8.
Yep, it's going to be the F1.8 because that makes the background very blurred. And so the person or the subject not being blurred helps them stand out. It isolates them from the background. And so that one aperture value, right, it does a lot for us. The aperture does a lot for us. It tends to be that lenses, which is where the aperture is, it's not in the camera, it's in the lens. That's the first control we have out of the 3 parts of the exposure triangle. The first thing we control is the aperture inside of the lens. And lenses that have smaller f values tend to be more expensive because they do so much more for us, right? The more open that is, the more light we get, the more background blur we get, the better we can isolate our subjects because they get to such a small aperture value. For instance, the lens I'm shooting on right now is a Canon 50mm f1.8, right? So it opens up all the way to an f1.8. Canon also makes the same lens that goes to an f1.4, right, which is just a little bit bigger, and an f1.2, which is just a little bit bigger. The f1.8 is about 140 bucks. The f1.4 is about 400 bucks, 300 to 400. And the one that goes to f1.2 is $1,400, right? So the more open those get, the more it does for us and the more expensive they get. When using aperture priority mode, what are you in control of and what is the camera in control of? We're in aperture priority mode. So you control the what? And the camera controls the what? You thought I was going to put the answer in just now, huh? Nope. I'm going to let you tell me what to put here. So you control the, when we're, let's see, I got one answer in my chat here that says, it says, you control the aperture and the camera controls shutter speed. Yes, okay, so you control the aperture, camera controls the shutter speed, and ISO, as long it shouldn't be capitalized, but I do it for a reason. ISO is set to. So there are three parts to the exposure triangle. Three, however you prefer to make your threes. Three parts to the exposure triangle: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. When we're in aperture priority mode, we're saying that's the important part and I'm in charge of that. Camera, you can control shutter speed and ISO as long as your ISO is set to auto. It's possible to set your ISO no matter what mode you're in, okay? But on a test, it's just gonna be those bits. You control the aperture, the camera controls shutter speed and ISO. Any questions about that question? Okay. What does AV on the mode dial stand for? There we go, Kaya. Yeah. Aperture. They got it to me in the chat there. Aperture priority. And specifically for Canon, they add that V in there because they're funny. Aperture value. But on any quiz or any test, it's going to be that aperture priority. What do you think? And it's on that page where this lesson is, but what does M on the mode dial stand for?
Manual?
Manual, yeah. Manuel. Manual, yep. And this is my preferred shooting mode. It's manual. But some people, professional photographers, are making money and all they do is use aperture priority mode because they can't control all three parts. And they're making money doing this for a living. By the end of this week, you're going to know how to shoot in full manual on a camera, and you'll know more than literally more than professional photographers that are out there making money with a camera today. This was in our lexicon. If anyone happened to read it or is reading the page now, what is camera shake? What is camera shake? Or where might you be able to find the answer, right? Maybe direct everyone.
Can I answer it?
Yeah, absolutely.
Isn't it what the shake, like the blurriness from the photographer shaking the camera?
Absolutely. Absolutely
Stick.
nailed it. And so to be verbatim with our lexicon, it is accidentally shaking a camera. Will it let me align center on this? No, whatever. Accidentally shaking a camera during shooting due to unsteady hands, which results in blurry images, right? So you might think you're steady as a surgeon, but your shutter speed, which is another part of the exposure triangle, might be so low that your subtle movements like this, holding a camera up, trying to be still, but you're like way too much Red Bull and coffee, and so your image is going to be super blurry. Camera shake. All right, what is the measurement of the aperture or the opening of a camera lens called?
Isn't it just like the F and then a number?
Yeah, and that is called an f-stop, right? So we stop the diaphragm to a certain number. It's called an f-stop. F-stop. So the aperture value of f1.8 is a measurement of the opening of that diaphragm. And we can stop it down to block more light out. All right. In cinema, those of you taking video, this f-stop works. That's a measurement of the light passing at the diaphragm of the aperture. If you're in video with Mr. Deeds, you can impress him with some extra knowledge. In video, in cinema, we have t-stops, and that's the measurement of the light at the actual sensor. So once it's past the diaphragm and reaches the sensor that's picking up all the light, those are called t-stops, a little extra bit. So what are the three parts of the exposure triangle? You're gonna get this question a lot because it's important.
Shutter speed, ISO, and aperture.
Yep, and I like to think of it in this order. Aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. And here's why I like to think of it in that order, and it doesn't matter, right? If you take a quiz, and I think there is one fill in the blank where it's like it wants you to put aperture first, but if you get that one wrong, but you have the right things, just let me know and I'll go in and give you the points. But here's why I like to think of it as aperture, then shutter speed, and then ISO. Because let me find an image to share. Okay. So I just want to find a good one. This one will probably work. I think. No, this one's better. Open image. I'm going to share the screen and show you. Okay. Well, let me zoom in on it. Let's try to zoom. Yeah, okay. So here we have a camera and a lens, right? This area would be the lens. The aperture is inside of the lens, right? So any light coming in first hits the aperture. Let me annotate. So light first comes in and hits the aperture right here. So light passes the aperture and it's being controlled at that point first. And then it's going to reach the shutter, which is going to be right around here, just behind the mirror, the shutter. And then it reaches the sensor, the image sensor, which is here, right? So aperture, shutter speed, and ISO is the sensitivity of the sensor to light. So aperture, shutter speed, ISO. Light kind of goes through a camera in that order, so I try to think of it that way because it helps me remember. Okay, clear all the drawings. Let's go back to here. All right, so we answered, oh, let me go to the right page. We answered all the questions for this page. Are there any questions about aperture value or aperture priority mode and how to control light and background blur with an aperture? This diagram is super helpful. So it looks like there's no questions about it. It's 1:30. I hope you are taking these questions that last trimester students, like by week 4, were like, I haven't been doing that, and now I wish I did, and I see the importance of it. So I took a day, which I'm not going to do again, but I took a day and we went through all of them one more time. But I'm really trying to impress upon you to copy and paste all these in a notes page and keep track of it. Keep track of it. Keep track of it. I'm going to give you the answers. If I go too fast, let me know. So if I click next, and I'm not going to go through it today, it's already a lot of information, but I'm just going to kind of briefly introduce it, right? We talked about A or AV, which is aperture priority mode. We did this one today. You need to read shutter priority. We're going to go over it together. We're going to go over 2 pages the next time together, and that'll be it. But shutter priority mode, very similar to aperture priority. Instead of being in charge of the aperture, you're in charge of the shutter, while the camera controls aperture and ISO. There's a diagram that explains the same thing, but instead of background blur for the creative part, we have motion blur for the creative part, right? But the same thing, we move this way on the scale, it gets brighter with more blur. We go this way on the scale, it gets darker with less blur. You're going to see a shutter opening and closing and example photos of what the shutter does in regards to motion blur. You'll see a live example on my video when I change the shutter speed, what happens. And, oh, good. And then we have self-reflection questions, right? And so we're going to go through and answer those questions. This will be our next one. So those two pages, the one we did today and this one, they're probably like the heaviest, like knowledge-wise. There's only one other lesson, and that's the art critique. That can be like brain melting, right? Like, oh, I'm just tired of this. But the next page looks similar, but we're going to breeze right through it. It's super easy. It looks similar, like, and as in-depth as the others. And writing-wise, I wrote a lot in there, so you can read it and learn. But when I cover it, it's going to be like piece of cake. Because really all you need to know from this page is keep your ISO at the lowest number possible. That's the rule. ISO low. And we'll cap that all off with looking at an exposure triangle and what that means. This will make sense. Any of you should be able to explain this by the end of this week. Right now you might look at it and be like, oh, okay, I see the aperture stuff, right? You'll get it all. And then, of course, self-reflection questions. So there's going to be 3 sets of self-reflection questions this week. After that manual lesson, I'm going to give everyone time to work on the camera modes discussion, just like you had a getting to know you discussion. You're going to have one about these camera modes. And then when somebody's already moving right along, then you'll have your check on learning. And I'll explain again, but it is due January 4th, right? I'm giving you time because I know for some people this information can be a lot. But if you use the notes that are on the announcement and or the self-reflection questions, you're going to kill it. You're going to ace this. Like, you're going to get every question exactly right. And there is no time limit. You get 3 attempts and it'll keep your highest attempt. So, you should probably wait unless you read through the other pages and you're feeling good about it. Like, so I'm going to respond to these questions that are in my chat. you could work on camera modes discussion if you read the other pages and they make sense to you. But you can wait until we meet again to do the camera modes discussion. That way I've had a chance to explain shutter and then manual to you. That'll probably help you. And then someone would like me to go look at those last 3 reflection questions. So absolutely. Just before I do that though, this is what you need to respond to in the discussion. So in your own terms, explain the exposure triangle. What is A or AV on a camera mode dial? What is S or TV? What is ISO? And then just like, have you been doing flashcards or journaling the questions? Like, are you doing what I'm asking? There is a rubric, and I'll put this up again. This is how I grade the discussion. You can see the rubric in the iPad. It's hard to get to sometimes for folks. So you might want to take a screenshot of this rubric right now. It's up to you. But basically, it's going to be verbatim means word for word. Exactly the way it's worded in our page, you're going to get 4 out of 4. And then from there, is it just like, the more detail, basically, the better. The more detail you give me, the better your score is going to be on here.